Hello, I'm Alizarin. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I painted this fall teacup. This is my sketch and here's the color study I did in my sketchbook. I'll start with the base layer using wet and wet technique. So I'm applying clean water all over the painting except for the cast shadow at the bottom. Now I'm preparing transparent gold deep, very dilute. The ratio of paint to water is tea-like consistency because this layer has to be extremely light since this is only to set the tone of the painting. Another option for this base layer is a very dilute burnt sienna. This will help to give an overall warm tone. I'm using size 10 round brush. It is quite a big brush, helps to cover large areas in no time. Round brushes tend to have a very fine tip. This helps to get to all the edges and tiny corners. And once you're done applying this layer, let it dry completely. This is my color palette for the leaves. I'm using cadmium-free yellow, Alizarin crimson, and neutral tint. Neutral tint is to create shadow colors. I can mix neutral tint with Alizarin crimson to create shadow colors for the red leaf. I can also mix neutral tint with cadmium-free yellow to create shadow colors for the yellow leaves. And a little bit of hooker's green to create some details. To paint this leaf, I'm going to use the wet and wet technique, and for that I'm going to apply a layer of clean water. I'm applying water on the whole of the leaf except for the part of the leaf that is folded up. Now I'm taking a milk-like consistency of cadmium-free yellow and applying it on the whole of the leaf except on the area around the central vein. Then I dropped a small amount of Alizarin crimson to create visual interest. Now I'm using a thicker consistency of hooker's green for the central vein and also for the smaller veins. In order to avoid the paint spreading too much, I'm using a thicker consistency, like that of cream-like consistency. And here in some areas, I'm using the yellow shadow color mixture. To paint this red leaf, I'm using the wet and wet technique. So first I applied a glaze of water. Then I took milk-like consistency of Alizarin crimson and applied it all over the leaf, except on the fold. I used the flicking motion of the brush towards myself to create those edges on the leaf. Then I dropped in some cadmium-free yellow and it mixes on paper to create a beautiful orange. To paint the fold on this leaf, I'm using the wet and wet technique. I'm first painting the right side and later on the left side. This automatically creates a central vein. I'm leaving a small area unpainted near the edges of the leaf to suggest its thickness. Then I repeated the same process on the left side of the leaf. Using the wet and dry technique here, I took a small amount of hooker's green and applied it once again on some parts of the veins to enhance vibrancy. Then I applied the crimson and neutral tint shadow color mixture at the base of the folded part of the leaf and used my brush to soften the edges. I used a slightly damp brush and a tissue paper to lift color here to create the vein. Using my 000 round brush and the shadow color mixture, I created some lines first and then used a damp brush to soften the edges. My color palette for the teacup: burnt sienna mixed with cobalt blue for gray, transparent gold deep, and Winsor Violet. I'm using transparent gold deep, cream-like consistency, to paint the golden line that runs inside the lip of the cup, and I'm painting on dry paper. Then I used a small amount of burnt sienna to drop in some places to create shadows. For the second layer on the cup as well as the saucer, I'm using a very dilute transparent gold deep to enhance the color. I'm applying paint all over the cup, the handle, and the saucer, except this small area, leaving there some highlight. I have fast forwarded this part of the video. Here I'm painting the flower and the leaf. For the leaf, I'm using burnt sienna and cadmium-free yellow. And I dropped in some Alizarin crimson as well to echo the colors that have been used in the painting. For the flower, I used cobalt blue and Winsor Violet. To create this engraved design or pattern on this teacup, I'm going to apply 2 layers. First, a very dilute consistency of the gray mixture. I'm painting it negatively. The negative painting technique is a very useful technique. It means that to paint something, you paint around it. So now what I'm doing is applying a very dilute gray mixture above and below the designs, and using my damp brush to soften the edges. And I repeated the same process at the base of the teacup. So here too, first I'm applying a cream-like consistency of transparent gold deep. And before it dries, I'm dropping in burnt sienna in some places. In order to make the teacup look round, I'm going to paint the shadow colors both on left and right, leaving the central area much lighter in value. The paint to water ratio is tea-like consistency, very dilute. And now I started giving some definition to the base of the handle by painting the shadows created by it. Now I'm using a very dilute gray mixture to paint the shadow created by the belly of the cup on its base. Now I'm applying the same gray mixture here to enhance the roundness of the cup, carefully leaving the highlighted area untouched. Here I'm giving a second pass on the patterns at the base of the teacup, but this time the paint consistency is thicker. This is quite a slow and long process, so I have fast forwarded this part of the video, but you can still see how the painting is progressing. Using the same grey color mixture, cream-like consistency, I'm now defining the lower part of the base of the teacup. Time to paint the handle. I'm using the same grey color mixture, tea-like consistency, to create some shadow shapes that will help us to define the shape of the handle. Now I'm using transparent gold deep milk-like consistency and painting the top part of the handle. I'm leaving unpainted some areas here and there so that the layers underneath can show through. These will be our highlights on the handle. Then I use some thicker consistency burnt sienna to create contrast in some areas. I did a second layer on the flower and the leaf so that they look more vibrant. To create some reflections in the cast shadow, I applied a layer of water and then dropped in some dilute Alizarin crimson. I did the same thing on the teacup. Time for another pass on the teacup. Here I am applying the same grey color mixture, thicker consistency, to darken the shadows. Then I did the same thing on the patterns here. The paper is dry. The paint consistency is cream-like. First I laid down the paint and then I cleaned my brush and took off the excess moisture with the tissue paper. And using this damp brush, I softened the edges. To increase the contrast in the darker areas on the handle, I mixed burnt sienna with neutral tint and once again applied in those areas. To create some visual interest on the leaf on the top of the teacup, I took some burnt sienna milk-like consistency and painted wet on dry and used my damp brush to soften the edges. To paint the cast shadow created by the saucer, I'm going to use the wet and wet technique. So I applied a glaze of water first. Then I dropped in the grey color mixture of cobalt blue and burnt sienna. To create some reflections of the saucer in the cast shadow, I am dropping in some transparent gold tip and some Winsor Violet for visual interest. Then a little bit more of the grey mixture. Since the cast shadows are the darkest near the base of the object, so I mixed neutral tint to the grey mixture and made it darker and then applied it at the base of the saucer. To paint tea, I'm going to use the wet and wet technique. However, I forgot to press record for like 3 minutes, and when I remembered, I was almost done with this layer. So what I'll do is I'll fetch my sketchbook and show you how I painted it. First I applied a glaze of water. I'm starting with burnt sienna, milk-like consistency, and I'm applying in these two areas. I'm using my brush to gently move the paint around. Then I mixed Alizarin crimson to transparent gold deep and created a bright orange and then applied it in the central area, followed by transparent gold deep. And Winsor Violet for just this corner. I dropped in some more of burnt sienna and the orange color mixture. And to recap, we have burnt sienna, orange color mixture, transparent gold deep, and Winsor Violet. So once this layer was dry, I'm moving on to paint the shadow of the leaf on the surface of the tea. I'm using the burnt sienna neutral tint mixture, but very dilute, tea-like consistency. This shadow extends to the cup as well, but for this I'm using grey color mixture, burnt sienna and cobalt blue. And let's not forget that there is some tea visible under the fold of the leaf. And as a final touch, I'm using a very dilute orange color mixture to apply in some areas to give a warm glow. And here's the finished painting. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please drop me a like, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. I will see you soon with a new tutorial. Bye for now.